The Altibox Norway chess tournament saw the clash between two legends, Magnus Carlsen, world number one and world champion, versus Fabiano Caruana. He was a challenger. So, in this position, white was Magnus playing against black, who was Fabiano Caruana. And after black played queen to c6, here we go into an endgame, which is the specialty of this channel. We focus on endgames, and this is in this video we shall particularly see how Magnus converted this equal looking, drawish looking ending into a beautiful victory for him. So the queens go off. Now you have this position. Now just think for a moment. This is a very symmetrical position. I mean, there is no, I mean, there is nothing of a hint of an advantage for any side, except that there is a problem on the c file with this pawn as well as the knight. So basically there is a problem on the c file, but apart from that, this position is very much equal. Now this is the speciality of Magnus. He would like to create and squeeze as much as possible out of a position, and he creates dynamic imbalance in the position. So this is the first imbalance that he creates. He gives up a bishop pair in order to damage black's pawn structure. So you can see this pawn structure is now damaged, and you have a very weak pawn on h6. So this is already a unbalanced, he's already creating a dynamic unbalance in the position. So let's see what happens next. Obviously black still has problems concerning his c files. White in the position played e3. So here we go, e3, and the bishops went off. After king takes, we have knight to a5. Again, black wants to solve the problem of his c file, because rook to c1 can be really annoying, and that's why knight to a5 was seen. Now we go knight to f3, knight c4 attacks the pawn on b2. That has to be defended, so rook b1. It's just a passivity for one move, and white will soon be fine. So c5 is now seen, king to e2, and here you can already see Magnus is bringing his king in the endgame. As if you compare this to black's king, he's still on g8, and that's quite a long way from the center. In the endgame, you would like to have your king as closer to the center as possible. Black would have really liked to have his king something around e7. That is a really active square. So anyway, that does not happen. So you can see already Magnus is having a little bit of something in this position. It's already something. So after this, there is, pardon me, after this we saw rook to c8. So just going on this c file, developing the rook on the c file, trying to counter white's rook. White played rook to c1, again just attacking the knight. Knight has to move, knight move back to d6. Now white is threatening to push forward with something like c4. This has to be stopped, because you cannot allow that pawn. It will be very strong, and it will definitely kind of dominate this pawn on b2, and that's why we cannot tolerate the pawn. We need to take it. So there we saw an exchange, and after b takes on c5, here we have another big moment. Here you can see there is another big dynamic change that has occurred. The c pawn is isolated, the a pawn is isolated and weak, the h6 pawn is weak, and these pawns are doubled. So already Magnus in the last few moves has created something out of nothing. He has squeezed something out of this position. He has created a dynamic imbalance in the positions, particularly in the pawn structure. So if all the pieces go off the board and we just go into a king and pawn ending, this is a completely winning king and pawn ending. Also, if you go into a king plus knight ending, this is still winning for white because of the damaged pawn structure. If you know the Rubinstein model, you'll know this position very well. So h6 pawn is weak, a7 pawn is weak. With the rooks off the board, this is completely winning for white. So Magnus has definitely created something out of this. He has already squeezed something out of the position. And this is what is so particularly interesting about his games. Whereas most people do not, I mean, they generally hesitate to go for this dynamic, dynamic changes in the position. Magnus does not. Magnus, whenever possible, he would like to change the nature of the positions, change the, like in this game, he changed the pawn structure, and definitely to his advantage. So let's see what happens next. Now we go rook to c2. Obviously, we would like to free the rook on b1. Obviously, it's protecting the pawn on b2, so we would very much like to free the rook. Maybe the rook can find itself a home on d1 or c1. Let's see. So here we go. Now there is king f8. The king is finally trying to come in the game, but it's already a little bit late. So knight to d2. The knight is finding better posture as there is no real good squares on f3. It is trying to go maybe on c4, and with the exchange of knights, this can be it can be a good idea. Or you can also go to b3. In that case, we can attack the pawn on c5. So let's see. Let's see. Generally, we are just keeping an eye on the c4 pawn right now, c4 square at the moment. So now we have after knight to e2. Just a second. Now we have c4 being played, and this is a very interesting moment. White plays rook to c1, intensifying the pressure on the c pawn. Black plays rook to b8, looking down on the b file. So you can already see something is going to happen. Some kind of exchange is going to happen, and in such situations, Magnus is very much plays like Kasparov. He likes to play prophylactic moves, and in this position, he played king to f3. King to f3. This is a very prophylactic move. First of all, it takes charge of the e3 e4 square, and it just basically moves out of the second rank. So in case of a future rook takes b2, there will be no check on the king on e2. So it's already taking some prophylactic measures. And the white king is definitely, again, if we compare both the kings, the white king is far superior and actively placed than black. So this is a prophylactic move, and Magnus, whenever there is something about to happen, you see this trait in both Magnus as well as Kasparov. They, before attack or before something dynamic happens, they just try to make prophylactic move. This is very typical trait that I think Magnus has learned from Kasparov. So very nice. Let's see what happens next. There is c3, and this was a big decision. Black here could have just hold on the position with something like rook c5, but white could then very easily improve his position. Rather, he decided to go for this pawn sacrifice and give Magnus Carlsen a passed pawn. So Magnus takes the pawn. If now everything depends on this. If this pawn on c3 is stopped and is blockaded securely, then there can be a possible draw, because after all the e3 pawn is also slightly weak. But if the pawn tries to roll ahead, then that can be a serious problem. Then that pawn can become a serious asset in white's position. So this is very neat now. Black's move has to be very careful. He plays rook to c5, which is already somewhat of a mistake. Knight to c4 was to be chosen because exchanging knights, and after that you can play rook takes c4, and generally it's a well-known idea that rook endgames are generally drawish rather than knight endgames. Knight endgames are more winnable, and there are a lot of winning chances in knight endgames. But in the rook endgames, Black, as Fabiano, would have had real chances of some draw. But he did not play this and rather went for the move rook to c5, allowing white to push forward with c4. So now you can see the pawn is starting to make something out of it. Magnus always makes the best out of what he has, and he's starting to push forward the pawn, which basically ties down the rook on c5. Whenever the rook moves, the pawn will try to force itself on c5 and push forward. So let's see what happens now. There is f5, just taking some control of the e4 and g4 square, making maybe also planning to play something like king e7, king f6, perhaps. Let's see. So king to e2, trying to get the king back into action. King e7. Again, king e2 is a very sensible move because Magnus senses that nothing is happening on this side of the board, on the king side of the board, and his king might be needed on the queen side. So this is something of an intuitive decision. So king e2, king e7, king to d3 protects the pawn, and now you can see this basically frees all the rest of the pieces. So now maybe a rook can move, maybe knight can move. So basically white has freed his position. So king to d7, the king is trying to get in the game. Rook to c3, rook to c6 is somewhat of a mistake already. because now he can push forward with c5, and this was the turning point of the game after rook to c6, because this shouldn't have been allowed. After all, the c pawn is a passed pawn, and as Nimzowitsch said, a passed pawn is a criminal which has to be kept under key and lock. Now white is allowed to push forward with c5, and that pawn has now become a serious concern for black. So you already see Magnus making the most out of it. He's squeezing the best out of what he can from this position. So now knight to e8, knight f3, knight again goes to f3 when it is ideal for him, and now there is already a threat of knight to e5. Oh, pardon me, knight to e5 check. I cannot make a proper error. Sorry for that. Yeah, so knight to e5 check is threatened, and now if we just go back, knight to f3, rook to a6 is played, trying to target the a3 pawn. Knight e5, taking control over the position, attacks the king, that's a check, and taking control over the c6 square. It basically means that our pawn will step one more square ahead. It can step one more step ahead at the right moment. So black just plays king to e7, and again you see this very typical of Magnus. Whenever making a big decision, he likes to make prophylactic moves, or something of a careful move. So he just plays king to e2, knight f6, rook to c2, some careful moves before finally pushing the pawn. Again, this is a trait which I perhaps might have learned from Kasparov. So knight to d5, the knight has found itself a very good square, very good outpost, and it's difficult to get rid of the knight from that square, but it's not really a problem for that for white. So now rook d3, rook to c8, rook b3. This, and here we see some regrouping of pieces in the next few moves, and this is where black makes this big decision. He plays e5. Now this is a really big decision. Black obviously cannot just sit back and hold on while white improves the position. So he decides to sacrifice a pawn, basically trade a pawn, trade the e5 pawn in return for the c5 pawn, which at first sight looks to be good for black. But the point is, after knight takes, rook takes, and one pair of rooks goes off, this has not improved black's position too much, because look at this, weak pawn over here, weak pawns over here. This just made things worse. It did not improve black's position. So Magnus again tries to make the best out of his position and plays rook check, attacking the pawn on a7, basically forcing king to e6 and win off another pawn. So Magnus is now, I guess, how many pawns up? Three. Okay, 2 pawns up. Magnus is now 2 pawns up, and what remains is now just a matter of technique, which is we can expect that from a world champion. So rook a5 attacks the pawn on a3, knight check, and after this we just protect the pawn. Yeah, there is no need to give up a pawn unnecessarily. Just hold on and try to improve. Rook a6, knight check. We get the knight in civilization back again. You can see Magnus does not let his pieces drown away. He would very much like his pieces to be together. And whenever he finds like one of his pieces is like far away from the action, like the knight here, he just brings it back. So in the game he played knight e5, just bringing all the pieces together. Look at this. So he just brings all his pieces together. So knight e5 we saw. Now we see h5, king to d2. Finally the king makes its entry. H4 we have knight to d3 check, and after rook c4, king c2, rook to d6, and the end is not far away from here. Now we have knight to f4, and this is where Fabiano Caruana resigns. So this is a very strong move. If that's taken, then we have rook to b4 followed by picking up the pawn, and both these guys are now targeted. Both of them are attacked, and one of them will fall. So white will win. Magnus will win another pawn, and after that it won't be difficult for him to win the game. So it's a beautiful conversion that just happened over here. If we can just go back, if you can just go back to move number 13, uh, I'll just take you back to move number 13. That's too far, I suppose. It's a very important point. Yep, this point. You can see the position is very much droish, except some problems on the c file, but those are not critical problems. Just black can play the knight a5, c5, rook c8, and try to solve those problems. Not really something serious. But Magnus here played this excellent move, bishop takes f6, and he started to create this dynamic imbalance in the position. And he basically used this uh, to his advantage. Like here we see another dynamic imbalance. There is a weak pawn on c5, weak pawn on e6, weak pawn on f6, and this was perfectly converted. And this is the difference between world class players like Fabiano and world champion like Magnus Carlsen. There is this little bit of it, just that little bit that Magnus is ahead of. It's not much, but it still makes a difference. So Magnus beautifully converted his advantage into a victory and again showed his endgame dominance. So hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. As you already know, our channel is all about endgames and mostly focuses on endgames. So if you would like, do subscribe and stay tuned for the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye.